Christopher Nolan just made the most expensive film of his career, and he changed everything about Homer's Odyssey. He cuts one of the poem's most famous episodes, turns Calypso into the most dangerous character in the movie, and makes the Laestrygonians look like Cylons in a way that actually says something deep about how we see ancient myth today. Homer wrote the Odyssey almost 2,800 years ago. Nolan's version makes it feel more relevant to 2026 than ever, by turning a warrior's homecoming into a 3-hour dissection of memory, guilt, and the cost of survival. Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, Tom Holland, Zendaya, Charlize Theron, Nolan's Odyssey just dropped in its 173 minutes of pure mythic chaos. This is my spoiler review and analysis. Looking back across Christopher Nolan's filmography, the Odyssey feels less like a departure and more like a story he's been working toward for most of his career. Memento was about a man trying to rebuild a life when he could no longer trust his own memory. The Prestige followed two men who sacrificed everything because neither could let go of the need to win. The Dark Knight trilogy asked whether a man could become a symbol without losing himself in the process. Inception turned the desire to return home into the emotional center of a massive science fiction heist. Interstellar stretched that same longing across decades, planets, and generations. Dunkirk stripped the idea down even further. Survival meant getting home. And Oppenheimer focuses on what happens when a man accomplishes the thing that defines his life, only to discover that success does not free him from the consequences. The Odyssey brings all those ideas together. Odysseus is another Nolan protagonist driven by intelligence, control, and the belief that he can outthink whatever stands in front of him. Like Leonard, he depends on the memory to hold on to his identity. Like Bruce Wayne, he returns home under hidden identity and has to decide what part of him still belongs there. Like Cobb, he spends the story trying to reach his family while carrying the damage of everything he's done along the way. Like Cooper, he returns to the people who lived through years he couldn't share with him. And like Oppenheimer, getting what he wanted does not erase the cost. The journey is not complete just because Odysseus reaches Ithaca. Home is no longer the place he left behind. His son has grown up without him. Penelope has survived by becoming as careful and as strategic as he is. His household has been invaded. His name has become both a memory and a political problem. So his final challenge is not another monster or another god. It is recognition. He has to prove who he is to the people who knew him before the war, while also confronting how much the war and the journey have changed him. Nolan keeps returning to this question. Can a person come back after becoming someone else? The ending gives Odysseus his home, but it does not return the years he lost. It gives him victory, but not innocence. It gives him reunion, but only after violence confirms that the man who left for Troy is not the same man who has come back. That's the most Nolan idea of the entire film. The destination matters, but the cost of reaching it is what defines the man who arrives. I'm Rob, and we look at fantasy, horror, action-adventure, prop culture, and all things geek. This is a constantly racing mind where every frame tells a story. This is a spoiler review, so from now on, heavy spoilers all the way through. You've been warned. Before we even dive into the film, I need to address the purists complaining about textual accuracy. We have to remember that every single translation of the Odyssey is inherently an interpretation. A translator's choices are always shaped by the specific biases, culture, and the time period they live in, meaning there is no single fixed original English version to be perfectly faithful to in the first place. Just like the Bible, where every translation comes from the fingerprints of the people and era that produced it. I realize that this may be an issue for some. My wife mentioned it. However, this film does not hold your hand. It starts in media res, leaning heavily into Nolan's trademark nonlinear storytelling. The movie opens with a bard, Travis Scott, tapping out a rhythm and recounting the legend of the Trojan Horse at a banquet attended by dozens of Penelope's suitors. Penelope stops it. Telemachus protests, but she doesn't want to hear it. She just wants her husband back. From there, the narrative violently intercuts between Odysseus' memories of the war, his grueling decade-long journey at sea, and the present-day crisis unfolding back home in Ithaca. In flashback, Nolan completely shatters the glorious myth of the Trojan Horse. Initially, it is presented with a sweeping romantic majesty, a breathtaking pinky lavender shot of the colossal wooden horse rising from the shallow waters of the beach. But then, we're pulled inside the horse. Here, Nolan strips away the glamour, showing the gritty, horrific reality of the Greek warriors trapped upside down inside the stifling structure for days. Men literally drown inside the horse as it gets stuck in the water, and the survivors are forced to stifle their shrieks of death to avoid being discovered. Outside, a young soldier named Sinon, Elliot Page, sacrifices himself to convince the Trojans that the horse is a gift for the goddess Athena, successfully tricking them into bringing it inside the city gates. Sinon actually believes this was the case. He was unaware that the horse's true purpose. When the Greeks emerged in the dead of night, stiff, with limbs still waking up, they began an absolute massacre as they slaughtered the Trojans in their homes, comparable to the sacking of Jerusalem when the Crusaders took the city 2,000 years later. In the chaos, Odysseus violates a Zeus law by murdering innocent Trojans, including a young priestess of Athena, desecrating her statue. This horrific act of war crimes and deception leaves him with severe PTSD, and the image of the dead priestess haunts him as the face of Athena throughout the rest of the film. Back home, 20 years have passed. Penelope, Anne Hathaway, and her son Telemachus, Tom Holland, are besieged by arrogant suitors consuming the palace's resources and disrespecting the laws of Xenia. That's Zeus's law of hospitality. That's one thing this adaptation gets incredibly right: the sheer terrifying weight of Xenia, the ancient law of hospitality, or Zeus's law. Today we think of hosting as a polite gesture. Back then it was a sacred, unbreakable contract. If you turned away a traveler, you just weren't being rude, you were risking the wrath of Zeus, who protected strangers. The suitors gorging themselves on Odysseus' estate isn't just a plot device to make us dislike them. It's cosmic crime. And that historical context is exactly what makes their final slaughter feel so deeply, terrifyingly justified. The suitors are led by the sniveling, draft-dodging Antinous, Robert Pattinson. We get a brilliant, infuriating reveal that as a young boy, Antinous actually tricked Odysseus' cousin Sinon into swapping places with him so Sinon would be sent to the Trojan War while Antinous stayed safely behind. I felt that Robert Pattinson was an absolute standout performance as the lead suitor, Antinous. He is so deceptively wicked and plays the sniveling coward so perfectly that he physically transforms into an incredibly punchable person. I genuinely wanted to slap the smug look right off his face, which is honestly the absolute highest compliment I could give to an actor playing a villain. He completely chews the scenery and grounds the climax by giving us a bad guy we absolutely love to hate. As Odysseus tries to get home, he recounts his agonizing trials. Nolan keeps the broad outline of the trials: underworld monsters, Thracia, but he shifts the emphasis from spectacle to ethics. On the beach, after the carnage that was Troy, Odysseus and his complement of 3 ships that look like something the Vikings used, and about 50 men per boat, leave for home. He has final words with Agamemnon and departs. His apparent second-in-command, Eurylochus Himesh Patel, asks why they aren't following Agamemnon's fleet home. He claims he wants to take the scenic route, and as his fleet is smaller, they need less provisions. Overall, there's a lot of island hopping in this film. Visually, Polyphemus, the Cyclops, is stunning. Nolan uses a terrifying 60-foot practical puppet controlled by Bill Irwin, giving it a twisted, deformed, almost Goya-esque design that looks incredibly grounded and real. The sequence plays out like pure survival horror. The creature simply traps them in the cave with a boulder, wakes up, eats one of the men in the dark, goes to sleep, and repeats the horrifying cycle. Odysseus and his men blind Polyphemus while he sleeps, and the crying out of the monster makes us horrifying. It's loud, it's visceral, it's theater-shaking. Another thing, Nolan completely removed the famous nobody trick from the poem and made the Cyclops almost entirely mute. But if we actually analyze this choice, it is kind of brilliant for this narrative. By making the monster mute, Nolan turns it into a cold, indifferent force of nature. As Matt Damon's Odysseus points out, we don't try to have conversation with ants, so why would this giant beast try to talk to us? But the true brilliance of this scene isn't the monster itself. It's what the monster reveals about our hero. The crew actually manages to outsmart the beast, utilizing classic design, the disguise of hiding under the sheep to escape the cave. They're safe. They could have just gotten into the freaking boat and sailed away. But this is where Nolan exposes Odysseus' tragic flaw, his massive, uncontrollable ego. Odysseus cannot stand the idea of slipping away unnoticed. He needs the monster to know who defeated it. Out of pure pride and a desire for revenge, Odysseus shoots an arrow into the creature's eye after they've already escaped. Now, this reckless act of hubris is what enrages the beast, gets even more of his own men killed, and leads to the devastating curse of Poseidon upon the entire fleet. Or at least, that's what his crew think. Nolan removed the witty nobody banter because he didn't want us cheering for a clever hero. He wanted us to realize that the crew isn't doomed by the monsters they face, they're doomed by their commander's pride. It completely flips the traditional narrative and proves why this movie is an absolute brutal character study. Then there are the Laestrygonians. A shockingly brutal sequence where armored giants attacked the crew, destroying 2 boats and decimating their numbers. My wife whispered, "What are those things?" I whispered back, "Cylons." Then I said giants. You gotta laugh. But it actually made me realize something pretty profound about how we consume ancient myths. So, you see, unlike the Cyclops with a single eye, Homer barely gave the Laestrygonians a visual design. He just said they were giants who threw rocks and ate people. Because the text leaves them as a blank slate, every generation just fills in the blanks with their visual language of their own culture. The ancient Romans painted them to look like invading barbarian armies. Victorians drew them as forces of wild nature. But us? We live in an area of sci-fi, CGI, and cinematic horror, so naturally we project our visual culture onto them. We make them look like sleek, terrifying killing machines, or, Cylons. So the next time you see a modern illustration of an ancient monster, remember, you're not really looking at ancient Greece. You're looking at a Rorschach test. We never really draw the monsters of the past. We just draw the monsters of our present. After leaving the giants, they come upon Circe's island. Christopher Nolan completely abandoned CGI in favor of visceral, Rick Baker-style practical body horror to depict Circe transforming the men. Rather than a simple flash of magic or a wave of a wand, Circe, played brilliantly by Samantha Morton, lures the starving soldiers in with a massive cauldron of food, which they consume with gluttonous, uncontrollable addiction. The transformation itself is a gruesome skin-crawling sequence reminiscent of an American Werewolf in London, where she physically sculpts their faces with bare hands, stretching out their snouts and rubbing their ears to manually reshape their bones into pigs. It's such a terrifying sequence that it's probably the primary reason the film earned a R rating. Now, this horrific ritual is deeply tied to her psychological perspective and the film's overarching analysis of men in war. Circe doesn't see herself as casting an evil curse. She believes she is simply stripping away their fake exteriors to reveal the animals they already are inside. In a lengthy monologue that taps into the profound sense of female rage, she points out that while these soldiers view themselves as disciplined heroes, they are truly just savages driven by an unfulfillable appetite to invade foreign homes and selfishly consume whatever they please. Because of the violent world these men have created, Circe is fully convinced that the crew intended to take advantage of her and steal more than just her food, making her magic a completely justified act of self-defense. The tension absolutely skyrockets when Odysseus, who avoids the transformation by refusing the food, and he aggressively confronts Circe and forces her to reverse the spell by threatening the life of her own sister, who is currently trapped in the form of a crow. As Circe turns the pigs back into humans, she tells the men to go back to your disguises. This perfectly cements her mindset. To Circe, the noble human soldier is the fake mask, and the sniveling, greedy swine is the true, authentic self. And in a brilliant moment of dark comedy, when Odysseus asks if she plans to change her sister back to human form as well, Circe casually declines, admitting that they simply get along better this way. In general, Nolan does more of a high-level summary of the scene. Circe does turn Odysseus' men into pigs, and Odysseus resists her magic, forces her to reverse the spell, However, in the poem, he and the men actually end up staying on the island for a full year before she directs them to the Underworld. Now, I'm thinking Nolan truncated it purely for pacing and tone. In a 173-minute film covering the entire epic, a year-long magical detour would kill the narrative momentum. Nolan also favors grounded psychological tension over prolonged fantasies, so he compressed it into a brief, visceral encounter that keeps the story driving urgently toward the Underworld. Circe tells Odysseus he must travel to the Underworld to speak with the dead prophet Tiresias. In a grounded take on necromancy, the men slit rams' throats so the spirits can drink the black blood to momentarily communicate. Here, Odysseus faces his guilt. He encounters the angry spirit of Sinon, who warns him about the suitors taking over Ithaca. He is also warned by the spirit of King Agamemnon, Benisati, who reveals he was assassinated by his own wife upon returning from Troy, planting a seed of terrifying doubt in Odysseus' mind about whether Penelope will remain faithful. Ultimately, the unburied spirits of Odysseus' own dead men swarm the army, forcing them to flee. It's a dark scene, emotional, heavy, visually. You can see the guilt in Odysseus' face. Following Tiresias' route, the crew narrowly survives the sea monster Scylla, the whirlpool Charybdis, and the sirens. So, if you went into this film expecting a massive Marvel-style CGI slugfest against mythological beasts, you were probably surprised, or in the case of some, disappointed. Nolan makes a very deliberate choice to gloss over the glamorous spectacle of the creatures. Scylla isn't some epic kraken. She is basically just a terrifying giant barnacle that we barely even got a clear look at. Sirens are kept entirely at distance, and in an impressive cinematic choice, we don't even hear their song. We only see Odysseus writhing in agony. Even the Cyclops is stripped of his famous banter from the poem and is treated more like an indifferent, terrifying force of nature. Some may call this underwhelming, but my analysis is that they are completely missing the point. Nolan downplays the monster fights because this movie is not about a hero slaying beasts. It is a brutal examination of the moral problem of Odysseus' lack of candor. And I wouldn't get too hung up on the imagery. Homer gave Scylla a highly detailed, grotesque physical description. 6 heads, 12 feet, 3 rows of teeth. Charybdis lacks a physical body, described purely as a violent, roaring, natural whirlpool. And the sirens have 0 physical descriptions. Homer focuses entirely on the deadly song and the surrounding rotting bones. Odysseus explains that the call isn't just one specific melody. It sounds different to every single person. He describes the siren song as representing everything a person might desperately want but cannot have, calling it an itch they already wanted to scratch but can't quite reach. For Odysseus specifically, the song acts as a psychological weapon that reaches straight into his immense crushing guilt. He reveals that the sirens forced him to question whether he even truly wanted to return home to Ithaca. Because if he finally makes it home, he has to fully remember exactly who he is and carry the horrific burden of everything he has done during and after the war. The call is ultimately an offer of complete surrender, a dark temptation to just give up his painful identity, let go of the punishing pressures of leadership, and stop fighting. It's such a profound character-driven way to handle the sequence. Instead of a generic monster encounter, the sirens become a terrifying mirror reflecting his deepest internal trauma, proving once again why this adaptation is an absolute masterpiece. What Nolan pulls from the original text is that Odysseus is an incredibly unreliable narrator who survives through deception but at a devastating cost to everyone around him. He is a man who constantly frames situations to absolve himself of blame. When he tells the story, he blames his men for opening the bag of wind or eating the sacred cattle, conveniently leaving out his own failures in leadership that allowed those disasters to happen. We see his lack of candor weaponized constantly. He sacrifices the young soldier Sinon through a lie just to make the Trojan Horse deception work. Later, he lies to his own crew by omission, purposely withholding the deadly truth that 6 will be eaten by Scylla because he knows that would panic and refuse to row. The monsters in this film aren't just action set piece. They are moral stress tests. And what they reveal is that the very trait that makes Odysseus so brilliant, his cleverness, his trickery, and his ability to manipulate the truth, is exactly what gets the entire crew killed. He survives, but Nolan forces us to look at the ledger and count the horrifying cost of the lies. After narrowly surviving the horrors of Scylla and Charybdis, the battered crew lands on Thrinacia, the island of the sun god Helios. Now, I love this sequence because it is relatively brief, but Nolan uses it to deliver a brilliant analysis of fate, free will, and human desperation. Odysseus explicitly warns his men not to touch the sacred cattle. But the cruel irony of the gods is that they trap the crew on the island with strong winds until they are literally starving to death right next to a forbidden food source. It is the ultimate philosophical stress test, challenging whether our base human appetites and sheer survival instincts will ultimately overrule our reason. Eventually, the starving men completely break down and feast on the cattle behind Odysseus' back. There's a brilliant, darkly poignant line in the scene that highlights the absurdity of human justification, pointing out that the men foolishly believed the gods wouldn't notice their massive transgression just because they tried to eat the cattle quietly in a pit. Up until this point, the crew has constantly blamed Odysseus' pride for their cursed luck. But this is the tragic moment they knowingly choose to commit their own fatal violation. And the consequences of this choice is a stunning, terrifying piece of visceral filmmaking. The wind temporarily stops, cruelly baiting the crew back onto the water before slamming them with a severe strobe light heavy thunderstorm. The sheer scale and terror of this stormy sequence is an absolute assault on the senses, completely wiping out the entirety of the remaining crew and leaving Odysseus to wash up on Calypso's shore, completely alone. It is a devastating, efficient sequence that proves Nolan doesn't need to drag a scene out to deliver a massive emotional and visual gut punch. He washes up on the shores of Ogygia, where the nymph Calypso, Charlize Theron, essentially date rapes him, feeding him lotus flowers that blur his memory to keep him as her lover for 7 years against his will. Now, in the original epic, Calypso is this ethereal, magical nymph offering Odysseus immortality in a lush, sun-drenched paradise. But Nolan strips away the fairy tale magic and turns her island into a grounded psychological prison. Charlize Theron plays her not as a mystical temptress, but as a formidable, complex woman locked in a tense 7-year standoff with a broken survivor, using lotus flowers to blur his memory rather than just casting spells. And honestly, watching the sheer willpower it takes for Odysseus to finally leave her island, I totally get its struggle. And let's be real, Charlize Theron makes that temptation painfully believable. Nolan doesn't let us off the hook by pretending that the prison isn't seductive. I definitely would stay, and my wife knows it. But by grounding the character this way, Nolan brilliantly turns the mythological plot device into a deeply human battle of wills. Calypso knows he is longing for something he can't remember. She begins to wean him off the flowers, even though he initially resists. Eventually, he builds a makeshift raft and escapes. Back in Ithaca, Telemachus takes a secret journey to Sparta to find news of his father that gives us one of the most important thematic moments in the entire film. There he meets John Bernthal's King Menelaus and Lupita Nyong'o's as Helen of Troy. A lot of online discourse got stuck on Helen's scarred face, treating it like a cosmetic choice instead of a statement. Nolan uses her battle-ravaged appearance as a physical representation of the toll the war has taken on a single human body, then underlines it with a dark joke. She's now the face that launched 500 ships instead of 1,000. But the real weight of the scene belongs to Menelaus. He sits Telemachus down and completely shatters the romanticized myth of the Trojan War. Bernthal plays him as a man who's done lying. Helen becomes the excuse, and he admits the Greeks went to Troy not for love or honor, but for land, money, and power. Don't we all? Menelaus strips away battlefield glory and tells Telemachus the ugly truth about the misery, human sacrifice, and the unspeakable horrors his father endured to win that war. It's a brutally emotional moment. Telemachus is brought to tears as he realizes the legendary father he's been chasing is not a clean myth hero, but a deeply traumatized man, shaped by a brutal imperialistic slaughter. The scene quietly anchors Nolan's overarching anti-war analysis. It tells us outright that the story we're watching is not about noble conquest. It's about the human wreckage left behind when empires dress greed up as destiny. We also find out that Clytemnestra, also played by Lupita Nyong'o, is their twin sisters, and her sister actually killed Agamemnon for the sacrifice of Iphigenia, their daughter, to get the winds so they could sail. Odysseus finally washes up on Ithaca. He is greeted by the goddess Athena, Xenia, who only he can see. I am thinking of Battlestar Galactica's Caprica 6 that only Baltar can see. Because of Agamemnon's mourning of his fate, he disguises himself as an old beggar to assess the loyalty of his home. In a heartbreaking touch by Nolan, Odysseus chooses to use the alias Sinon, carrying the name and the heavy guilt of the young boy he sacrificed back at Troy. This is where we really get to spend time with John Leguizamo's character, the swineherd Eumaeus. I've said it before, but Leguizamo gives an absolute career best Oscar-worthy performance here. Eumaeus has essentially been acting as a surrogate father to Telemachus during Odysseus' 20-year absence. When the disguised Odysseus finds him, Eumaeus is injured. The suitors have brutalized him and maliciously killed off his dogs and took his livestock. Through Eumaeus, Odysseus learns just how far the rot in his kingdom has spread. Robert Pattinson's Antinous and his crony Polyphemus have discovered that Telemachus is traveling back from Sparta, and they have orchestrated a ruthless ambush to assassinate the young prince so they can permanently steal the throne. Nolan crafts this assassination attempt into an incredibly tense, visceral sequence. The suitors corner Telemachus inside a temple of Athena, mercilessly slaughtering his men and his guide, Mentor. But Odysseus intercepts the ambush to rescue his son. We get this exhilarating escape sequence from the exploding temple that honestly plays out with a kinetic hand-to-hand energy of a Jason Bourne movie. But the best part about the sequence is the dramatic irony. Odysseus and Telemachus fight side by side to survive the ambush, but Odysseus completely maintains his beggar disguise. Telemachus has spent his entire life in the shadow of a father he never knew. It serves as the ultimate test of Telemachus' character and his devotion to Zeus's law of hospitality. He initially treats the stranger with the utmost respect and brings him into the palace, setting the stage for them to secretly hide the armor and weapons for the final massacre. This leads to some of the most emotional moments in the film. His elderly, faithful hunting dog, Argos, now dying on a dung heap outside the palace, put there by Antinous, recognizes his master after 20 years, wags his tail one last time, and peacefully dies. A loyal handmaiden washing his feet recognizes a boar hunting scar from his youth, and at the beginning of the film, keeping his secret. Still in disguise, Odysseus confesses to Penelope his deep guilt over the war crimes he committed at Troy, begging her to move on. Now, I want to pause and talk about one of the most important thematic layers Christopher Nolan added to this film, because it completely recontextualizes the entire movie. Throughout the story, you keep hearing the characters nervously talking about the end of their era. They repeatedly mention this shadowy, terrifying threat known as the people from the sea, who are supposedly going to bring about the collapse of the Bronze Age civilization. I chuckled. If you know your history, like Eric Klein's famous lecture on the year 1177, you know that the Sea Peoples were a real historical confederation of groups who were blamed for the generations by historians as the boogeyman who violently destroyed the interconnected civilizations of the late Bronze Age. Of course, nobody called them that, but Nolan was making a thematic point. So Nolan uses the actual history to deliver a crushing twist in the third act. Odysseus finally realizes that they are the Sea Peoples. It is the Greeks themselves who are the terrifying invaders bringing about the end of the world. By building the Trojan Horse and slaughtering innocent Trojans inside their own city walls, they completely violated Zeus's law of hospitality. And as they try to get home, we see them acting as ruthless conquerors, landing on coastal villages, burning them down, and terrorizing the locals. Odysseus realizes that civilization isn't falling to angry gods or mysterious outside monsters. It is falling because of the war crimes. It is falling to the hubris, cruelty, and deception by his own men. By making the Greeks heroes, the actual villains of history, this to me seems obvious, but there is more to the end of the Bronze Age. This is just a storytelling device. While it is true the Trojan War was at the end of the Bronze Age, the people didn't recognize that term, nor did they the term Sea Peoples. That is a 19th century term, but a great narrative device. Penelope, ready to end the standoff, declares she will marry the man who can string Odysseus' massive heavy bow. and shoot an arrow through a series of axe heads, a feat we see Odysseus perform in flashback near the beginning of the film. Anne Hathaway spent much of her career moving between characters who are underestimated and women who understand far more than the people around them realize. She began with the open-hearted comedy of The Princess Diaries, then moved into more adult work with Brokeback Mountain, The Devil Wears Prada, and Rachel Getting Married. Her performance in Rachel Getting Married earned her her first Academy Award nomination, while Les Miserables brought her an Oscar for the Best Supporting Actress. And her career has never settled into one clear category. She can play romantic comedy, musical tragedy, grounded family drama, fantasy, science fiction, and comic book spectacle. But many of her strongest characters share something with Penelope. They enter situations where other people believe they understand them, then gradually reveal how much control, intelligence, or emotional force she has been holding back. This is also Hathaway's third film with Christopher Nolan. In The Dark Knight Rises, she played Selina Kyle as someone, constantly performing different versions of herself. She could be vulnerable, seductive, frightened, or dangerous, depending on what the moment required. In Interstellar, Amelia Brand was both a scientist and a woman willing to argue that love could carry information beyond what cold logic could explain. Brand was separated from the person she hoped to reach, while time and distance made that reunion almost impossible. Penelope carries pieces of both characters. Like Selena, she survives through performance. She manages the suitors without openly revealing every part of her plan. She allows them to believe they are competing for her hand when she is really buying time, protecting Telemachus and preserving what remains of the Odysseus kingdom. And like Brand, she has maintained a connection to someone separated from her by distance, time, and the possibility of death. But Penelope is not simply waiting. That is the key to Hathaway's performance. Odysseus has been fighting monsters and surviving the sea, but Penelope has been fighting a slower war inside her own home. The suitors eat his food, occupy his palace, threaten his son, and threaten her marriage as a political prize. She cannot fight them physically, so she survives through patience, misdirection, and control. Hathaway plays that pressure without turning Penelope into a passive symbol of loyalty. She is effectively ruling Ithaca, even though the political structure refuses to officially recognize her authority. She understands that choosing a new husband will not only end their marriage, it will probably lead to Telemachus' death and place the kingdom in the hands of whichever suitor can take it by force. And that gives the bow challenge more meaning than a simple test from the original story. Penelope creates a situation designed to expose the difference between the men occupying her home and the man who once ruled it. She understands the bow, she understands Odysseus' strength, and she understands what will happen if the stranger standing before them is truly her husband. Now, in that moment, she's not being rescued, she's setting the stage. Hathaway's performance also gives the reunion its uncertainty. Penelope has spent years protecting the memory of Odysseus, but the man who returns is not the man who left. He is disguised, traumatized, violent, and followed by the consequences of everything he did during the war and the journey home. So recognition alone is not enough. She must decide whether she can still trust him, and Odysseus must recognize that Penelope has changed too. She has raised their son, protected their kingdom, and survived a siege without him. He cannot simply walk back into Ithaca and restore the life they had before Troy. That is what makes the final decision to leave together important. Odysseus does not remain on the throne and pretend that everything has returned to normal. Telemachus inherits the responsibility of ruling Ithaca, while Odysseus and Penelope finally choose the journey they were denied when he left for war. The ending turns Penelope from the person waiting at the destination into the person who decides what happens after the hero arrives. And that is where Hathaway becomes essential to the film. Matt Damon carries the physical journey, but Anne Hathaway gives the homecoming its emotional meaning. Without Penelope, Ithaca is simply a location Odysseus has spent years trying to reach. With her, home becomes a relationship that both of them must choose again. Holland plays Telemachus, and this is easily his most mature adult performance outside of the Spider-Man franchise. At this point in his career, you can now deeply feel his frustration as a son missing a father he never knew, even if it's agonizing to watch him struggle with the inability to stop the men taking over his home. All the suitors fail the test. The disguised Odysseus steps up, successfully strings the bow, accompanied by a massive crescendo in Ludwig Göransson's score, and effortlessly fires the arrow. He immediately drops the disguise, turns and shoots the suitor in the neck, kicking off a brutally violent, gory massacre. With the help of his son, Telemachus, and his loyal servant Eumaeus, John Leguizamo, Odysseus slaughters the suitors in his own halls, mirroring the brutal betrayal he committed inside the walls of Troy. Some people were calling this the John Wick scene, but the way Nolan stages it feels more like a Jason Bourne moment to me. Tight, brutal, and grounded. Eumaeus and Telemachus have the weapons locked up in a room upstairs. Unfortunately, one of the Antinous men gets into the storeroom, but Eumaeus locks him in. The man starts breaking through the floor and drops the weapons into the hall below. After the brutal battle with dozens of suitors, as they start to wind down and he's wounded and spears sticking out of him, he specifically corners and kills Antinous, finally avenging the young boy Sinon. The film ends on a beautifully somber Nolan-esque note. After resting in Penelope's arms, a recovering Odysseus realizes that he cannot shake the horrors of the Trojan Horse and the cycle of violence he perpetuated. In a final anti-war act, he and Penelope abdicate the throne to their son, Telemachus. They decide to sail west into the unknown to honor his fallen men, trying to leave the bloodshed behind. Now, I can't talk about a film of this scale without diving into the performances, because the ensemble Christopher Nolan has assembled here is working at absolute top of their game with some caveats. So let's start with our lead. I have to give Matt Damon his props here, because he delivers what might be one of the best performances of his career. Yes, even better than Jason Bourne. He anchors this massive epic perfectly by playing Odysseus as the anti-Oppenheimer. Instead of the whole movie circling around him, he acts as the stoic, PTSD-stricken center, while the epic events circle around him. I genuinely forgot I was watching Matt Damon. He completely transforms into the haunted warrior. As far as the diverse supporting cast, Zendaya's Athena isn't just a goddess. She's wisdom made flesh. Lupita Nyong'o plays both Helen and Clytemnestra, showing us two sides of the same devastating coin. John Leguizamo's Eumaeus is the heart of the film, and this is the point. Homer's world was Mediterranean, interconnected, diverse. Nolan's casting isn't modern revisionism. It's a reminder that these stories are human stories. Grief, loyalty, cunning, rage, none of that has a race. Every single one of these actors brought their A game. They didn't just play roles, they made you feel the weight of 20 years, the sting of betrayal, the hope of homecoming. Diverse casting done right isn't about checking boxes. It's about showing what Odysseus' journey belongs to all of us. And this cast, they proved it. And Homer was certainly aware of human diversity in skin color and hair texture, and he occasionally noted it for poetic or descriptive effect. However, a character's worth, heroism, and identity in the Iliad and Odyssey were determined entirely by their arte, their excellence, metis, cutting, piety, and loyalty, never by their skin color. Now, behind the scene, you can see that the crew is working at its absolute top of their game to make this world feel tangible. Cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema shot the entire film on IMAX cameras. The lengths this crew went to are unbelievable. They actually had to build custom heavy insulation blimp over the noisy IMAX cameras. The motors just, too loud, just so they could capture dialogue on the set without the machinery drowning the actors out. They shot practically on real mountains and oceans, meaning there are no blurry green screen fuzz killing your immersion. When Odysseus' men are caught in the ocean storm at night, it's pitch black, lit almost entirely by lanterns and on-set strobe lighting. We also have to talk about Ludwig Göransson's score. Göransson recently worked on The Mandalorian and Grogu. Once again, he stripped away the traditional orchestra and utilized a lot of ancient strings and instruments and heavy percussive synths. It's haunting, bass-heavy score that literally shakes the theater. Add in the incredibly efficient pacing by editor Jennifer Lane and the gorgeous detail sets from production designer Ruth De Jong, and you have a massive technical triumph. No mid-credit scene, no post-credit scene. The only thing after the credits is you arguing about the ending in the parking lot. Hey, the critical response to the Odyssey remains extremely strong, although the Rotten Tomatoes score has dropped slightly as more reviews have arrived. The film now holds a 95% score on Rotten Tomatoes, down from 96% on Thursday. The popcorn meter has increased from 96 to 97%, showing an even stronger response from verified audience. Metacritic remains unchanged at 89 out of 100, placing the film in its universal acclaim category. That score is now based on 60 credit reviews, up from 57 on Thursday. The Metacritic user score has also risen sharply, moving from a generally unfavorable 2.6 to a 5.0 from more than 1,500 rating. Opening night audiences gave the film an A cinema score, matching the strong verified audience response and suggesting positive word of mouth beyond Nolan's established fan base. Critics continue to praise Hoyte van Hoytema's IMAX cinematography, Ludwig Göransson's score, the physical scale of the production, and Matt Damon's performance as Odysseus. The main criticisms involve the film's nearly 3-hour runtime, uneven pacing, some emotional distance, modernized dialogue, and Nolan's change to parts of the Homer's mythology. First off, this is not a documentary, and is definitely not a museum exhibit or Homer's text. I never expected one. On this channel, we talk about stories, why we tell them, and more importantly, why we retell them. The Odyssey is one of the most retold stories in human history, and Nolan's film is another turn of the wheel, not an attempt to freeze the poem in amber. So if you watched any of my other videos, you already know the pattern. When we watch adaptations, they almost never match the version of the story living in our heads. Every retelling adds, subtracts, or mutates something. Nolan cuts whole episodes, compresses others, and invents new turns like the Sea People twist and Calypso's lotus-fueled memory prison to speak directly to a modern audience. Whether that appeals to you is your choice, but it's not a failure of the film. It's the nature of myth. I made my peace with that a long time ago. Stephen King has said that his books and their movie versions are two different mediums, trying to tell a story. Sometimes he hates the film, sometimes he wishes he'd written the way the filmmaker rewrote it. My favorite book is Dune. No adaptation has ever matched my internal headcanon, and yet I still love watching different directors crash their sensibilities into that desert. Nolan's Odyssey works the same way. If you care deeply about the late Bronze Age as actual history, you should read a historian. If you want mythic, fantasy, horror, action, adventure story about guilt, homecoming, and the end of the world, this film delivers. It's dark, it's loud, it turns the Trojan Horse into a war crime, makes Odysseus the architect of its own curse, and ends with a couple walking away from the throne rather than pretending the past just didn't happen. For some people, that will be too bleak or too relentless. For me, it checked every box. I saw it twice on opening day, back to back. Not once was I bored. And not once did I have an issue with the sound mix. Göransson's score feels like a cousin to Bear McCreary's Battlestar Galactica work, rhythmic, percussive, often non-orchestral, but it serves the film instead of drowning it. I love the film. I love the cast. I don't care what gender they are. I don't care what race they are. I love the acting. I love the way Nolan rewired a 2,800-year-old story into something that doesn't get bogged down in ancient paradigms, but still respects the weight of the myth. For me, the Odyssey is still a 5 out of 5, a modern retelling that knows exactly what it wants to say about war, home, and the stories we tell ourselves to live with and what we've done. The primary job of a myth is to remain alive, and myths only stay alive by being retold in ways that speak to the people hearing them now. While the friction and backlash are a natural part of cultural change, the flexibility of these stories is not a bug. It is the very feature that allowed them to survive for nearly 3 millennia. Did you like the film? Did it land with you, or was it too loud or too dark, or both? Did you enjoy this new take? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know. If you liked the analysis and review, click the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching. And remember, Homer is always better when spoken in the original Klingon. Take care.